In this video, we're looking at sketching gradient functions. So the question is to sketch a gradient function for each of the following curves. And so what we're going to be doing this is sketching a graph that will tell us what the slope of the original function is. So here is our first curve. Now the first thing that I want to do is to identify where we have positive gradients, negative gradients, and stationary points. You can see here this first section of the graph. This has a negative gradient, and we come down to our first stationary point where the gradient turns then into a positive gradient. So the value is increasing going from left to right. We then reach our second stationary point and the gradient changes again into a negative. And then we have our third stationary point and the gradient returns to a positive. Now the gradient function represents the slope of the function at each point on the curve. So if the curve is increasing as we move from left to right on the graph, then the sign of the gradient function will be positive. If the curve is decreasing from left to right on the graph, then the sign of the gradient function will be negative. Where a curve has a stationary point or a horizontal slope, then the gradient function will be equal to 0 at that point. So what you can see here on the right hand side, I've put in the 3 stationary points. That is where it will equal to 0, because that is the value of the gradient. I've then drawn the curve so that it has a negative y value prior to x1, because that is where the gradient is negative. We then have a positive value between x1 and x2, because that is where the gradient in the original function is positive. From x2 to x3, our y value is negative, because the gradient in the original function is negative. And then extending beyond x3, we have positive y values because the gradient is positive. In our second curve, you can see 2 stationary points at x1 and x2. Prior to x1, we have a positive gradient, and from x1 to x2, we have negative gradients, and x2 and beyond, we have positive gradients. And so when we plot this, as you can see, at x1 and x2, the y value is equal to 0. In the gradient function, the y values are greater than 0 in values where x is less than x1. And between x1 and x2, the y values are negative because there is a negative gradient. And for values greater than x2, we have y values that are positive, again because the gradient is positive. I hope you found this video helpful.